Hey everybody, thanks for coming on tonight. The time now is 11:51, and it's February 2nd. And tonight we're just going to finish up our last chapter of Conquerors and Conquistadors. Conquistadors or Convicts, my bad. um, so yeah, I just wanted to just give a quick shout out to everyone again that's subscribed so far, and really left comments and gave their own perspective on things. We really appreciate feedback, so thank you very much for that. I just want to run an update, and by the time this video is uploaded, I think everything should be good. We are on Spotify now. I will I'll make a community post regarding that soon, like within the next few hours or so, 6 hours. So yeah, please reach out if you have any questions. I got the email. But yeah, without further ado, we're gonna start this article. Cholo, unless you had anything you wanted to say.
Well, yeah, the Spotify thing was just because you guys were crying about it for the longest time ever. So, and then update on the Portuguese thing. So, the genealogist, I don't know, there was an issue with I think communication with the secretary. So he was looking at the wrong lines that I can't use. So hopefully that gets resolved, and I'm still viable to get the naturalization. I'd love to be able to do it through the Jewish descent. But we'll see if it's feasible. Like, the reason I can't use the lines they were originally looking at is because my maternal grandfather is just not on my birth certificate, or my mom. So, 25% of my ancestors are just blocked. So hopefully this still works out, guys. But yeah, just quick update on that. But I'll go ahead and share the document here. Let's see.
And for those that are just tuning in, maybe they're new, the reason we are covering this article is because there's a indigenous component to this journey to the Philippines, the Spanish outpost at the time. And it is the fact that there were a lot of native, mixed indigenous folks, probably a lot of Tlaxcalan people that were on these voyages that lasted from like the late 1500s to 1700s, 1800s. So quite a long time. And, the outpost was not very well managed. So there's a lot of issues between Spaniards. And when I say Spaniards regarding this voyage, obviously there was a lot of, native people that were, I guess you could say, classified as Spaniards too, because they fought for Spain against the Philippines people. Well, it's funny to say Philippines people because, before even the earlier stages of the colonization, they didn't see themselves as Filipinos, or the country wasn't even called that. But anyway, I digress. It eventually was called that within time. But yeah, we're going to start on this article here. And Juan Chaloa,
I'll take away the first page, bro. So one Jesuit passenger described them, and I'm pretty sure they're talking about a Spanish crew here, as vile men who are vagabonds that have navigated a great part of the world, untied in loyalty to any specific king, but only to the situation occasion that allowed them to live and support themselves. Almost inevitably, the crew turned to mutiny once more, and the religious passengers had to join with the officers in keeping the crew in hand. They made an emergency stop to send 5 mutineers to Manila and take on reinforcements in their place, before finally completing the voyage to Guam. The isolated nature of outposts such as the Marinas and the Moluccas also enable widespread corruption among officers and royal officials. The governor of the Moluccas, Pedro de Heredia, died shortly after the conclusion of the mutiny in 1634, although not before an investigation had been initiated against him for corruption. Following his death, the governor of the Philippines, Sebastian Hurtado de Corcuera, accused Heredia of systematically embezzling funds sent from Manila to Ternate by paying large amounts of wages principally soldiers who had already died or who had deserted, while withholding the wages of soldiers who remained. He was also accused of selling goods to the soldiers at inflated prices. Rumors of this situation had spread among the soldiers stationed in Manila, and none would volunteer to serve in the Ternate for fear that they would be forced to live as slaves, como esclavos, without the possibility of returning to Manila. The corruption allegations aimed at Pedro de Heredia are emblematic of the fact that royal officials could manipulate the situation of shortages and isolation to their own advantage. While the full extent of corruption across the Philippines is not clear, it is certainly evident that the corruption was endemic to isolated outposts such as the Moluccas. One of Heredia's predecessors, Don Jeronimo de Silva, was accused of trading away supplies sent to feed and clothe the garrison for his own personal gain.
Meanwhile, Heredia's successor, Captain Francisco Suarez de Figueroa, who was said to be a man that by night and by day does not leave the gambling tables, and his suitability as someone in charge of the distribution of wages and supplies was seriously questioned. Similar corruption charges were also laid against the governor of the Marina Islands, Don Damian de Esplana, who was said to have hoarded supplies and sold them back to the soldiers at inflated prices, while keeping the majority of their wages for himself. Soldiers were thus driven to rebellion not simply by the material conditions that they experienced in the presidios, but also in response to situations of exploitation imposed upon them by their officers. Yet, in addition to this, soldiers who rebelled against the more fundamental nature of the service in the Philippines, which has already been mentioned, was often characterized by coercion and unfreedom. Instances of desertion and mutiny were common among the convict population of the Philippines. Forzados frequently attempted to desert from their companies. In 1602, Pedro de Acuna noted that the forzados sent into the Philippines had a habit of escaping. So time out. The forzados are, did we figure out who that was again?
Forzados, they're basically people that were forced from Mexico to just come here for being crimes. I think that's what I remember about it.
Okay, cool.
Basically, all of them were forzados.
All of them. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I had to leave off at here. The forzados arriving in the Philippines often escaped and went to live among indigenous or Chinese communities and frequently engaged in robbing the indigenous of their beast or burden and devastating their ranches of their livestock. Talking about indigenous, they mean by the natives of the Philippines.
Yep.
Some convicts even, which is funny because, again, like Spaniards, I think it gives, if someone was just reading this, they might think of Spaniards as like Iberian people, but probably a lot of these people, as we said, were probably native. Indigenous.
Well, they said most of these people were like mestizos or mulattoes, bro.
Yeah.
So mixed natives or black people.
Yeah, exactly. Going back. Devastating the ranges. Yeah. Some convicts even found their way back to New Spain. I don't know how they did that, unless they obviously got on a ship, but like other way to get back. Others attempted shipboard mutinies even before they reached Manila. Dang.
All right. The most noteworthy cases of mutiny among both forzados and ordinary soldiers occurred in Guam in the 1680s. Between the years 1684 and 1690, Guam witnessed a total of 5 attempted and actual mutinies. The most successful of these occurred in 1688 when a group of soldiers led by a Mexican convict seized control of the island for a period of 3 months, placing the governor and military commander in chains. The action of these soldiers sent shockwaves across the Pacific from Manila to Mexico City and convinced many royal officials that the transporting convicts across the Pacific was both undesirable and dangerous. I don't know why they did this to begin with. It's dumb. Instances such as this placed doubt in the minds of many royal officials on both sides of the Pacific about the utility of the forzado system as an effective criminal justice method, since it was apparent that the Philippine authorities lacked the capacity to control the forzado population adequately and relied on them to supplement their military weaknesses. Nonetheless, forzado transportation continued, and barely 2 years after the conclusion of the mutiny in 1688, a group of more than 40 convicts were shipwrecked off the coast of the Marina Islands. A colony readily accepted them and put them to work, yet within a matter of months, these convicts hatched a conspiracy to murder all the missionaries and royal officials in Guam, seize a ship, and set sail for Peru. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out, and the 23 of the would-be mutineers were executed. Oh, man, that's harsh. The rest of the convicts were kept in irons and later sent to Manila.
These have got to be all natives. all native people, man.
Yeah.
Or mixed natives. It's crazy. Because I think like the royal, the officers, a lot of the time I believe were Iberian. or at least that's how it was during the initial phases of conquest.
More than
Um,
likely, they were still Iberian. I mean, maybe you could have had some mestizo or mixed native officers, but I think most of them
mhm.
were probably actually just Iberian because they were making a career out of it. And so,
Yeah, exactly. Especially like after the fall of Tenochtitlan, like they had a lot of natives, Tlaxcalans. So the Spaniard officers were likely, yeah, the
yeah.
officers were Iberian. Um, then as time went on, you would have mixed natives that would be in those roles. But yeah, we'll start up more. The episodes of mutiny in Presidios like the Moluccas and the Mariana Islands are starkly revealing about the nature of military service in the Spanish Pacific. As often forced and coerced recruits subject to conditions of material deprivation, isolation, and the cruelty from their commanding officers, the Spanish soldiers found that their loyalty to the imperial project was sorely tested. Although these soldiers were essential in the establishment of the Spanish rule in the Philippines, their disobedient actions could equally precipitate the unraveling of the empire. This is most evident when we consider the final factor of soldiers' lives in the Spanish Pacific. Their involvement in the defense of Spanish outposts against both external and internal threats. More than not, we find that a chronic shortage in voluntary recruits, coupled with a lack of sufficient supplies, crippled the defensive capabilities of the colony and forced the authorities in Manila into a tenuous over reliance on indigenous soldiers. Again, I believe they mean the natives of the country, Philippines.
Yeah.
Um, this impact was most strongly felt at the height of the Hispano-Dutch conflict in the first half of the 17th century, when soldiers were forced into regular confrontation with Dutch naval forces intent on disrupting the Spanish presence in the East Indies. Shortages of soldiers were felt particularly keenly in remote presidios such as the Moluccas and Formosa, where the Spanish forts were established in close proximity to Dutch forts located on the same islands. The Dutch regularly set up naval ambushes to engage the ships arriving at the Moluccas with aid and military reinforcements from Manila. One such instance occurred in 1628 when the Dutch engaged a number of Spanish ships entering the narrow strait between the islands of Ternate and Teodor. The Dutch pursued the Spanish vessels towards their port and eventually overtook one of the ships and forced it to run aground, causing all the soldiers to fall into the water. The remaining Spanish vessels prepared to fight, but they were quickly overpowered when the Dutch sent a cannonball flying squarely into the Spanish gunpowder stores, causing causing the ship to explode. After the ship had burnt itself out, the Dutch salvaged 3,000 pesos and other goods that were destined as aid for the soldiers stationed in the Presidio. 20 Spaniards, 15 convicts, and 2 captains of infantry died during that battle. While not all these encounters favored the Dutch side, the actions of the Dutch in the Moluccas were enough to encourage some governors to consider abandoning the position altogether.
Possibly the most devastating defeat during the 17th century was the loss of Formosa to the Dutch in 1642. In the late 1630s, Governor Hurtado de Conquera had deemed Formosa of secondary importance to Spanish interests in the Philippines and had systematically starved the prestigios in Formosa of both men and supplies in order to free up resources for other prestigios. On the eve of the successful Dutch invasion, the governor of Formosa wrote to Manila and describes the soldiers as few, and most of them are boys and puny natives. Oh my God. The better quality soldiers had left the islands, and those who were left were incapable of military action. A previous invasion by the Dutch had been met with no resistance, according to the governor, not because I had faltered the desire to fight, but because I had no one left. Shortly after this, the Dutch captured the Spanish fort in Geelong and expelled the Spanish from the island altogether. At the same time, Spanish aims of subjugating indigenous populations and transforming them into tribute-paying members of the empire were also frustrated owing to the lack of sufficient military strength. Major uprisings throughout the 17th century led to a significant contractions of territorial control. This occurred notably in the provinces of Cayuga in the 1620s, when a large-scale indigenous uprising resulted in the complete expulsion of Spanish missionaries and soldiers for more than half a century. Some areas of this province were never brought back under Spanish control. Moreover, Maroon communities across northern Luzon continued to run raiding missions against Spanish settlements for the duration of the 17th century, with Spanish forces rarely able to retaliate in any meaningful way. A similar observation can be made about the Muslim territories of Mindanao and Jolo. Although these islands were the sites of the two greatest military victories the Spanish boasted in the Philippines during the 17th century, these victories were in reality very fleeting. Spain never managed to exercise any meaningful power in these regions and was forced to withdraw completely in 1663.
Yet, despite the vulnerabilities and almost against all odds, the Spanish managed to retain a presence in the Pacific, and over the course of the 17th century, slowly consolidated their control within the heartlands of central Luzon and parts of the Visayas. Although they succumbed to the Dutch in the Moluccas and Formosa, to the Moros in Mindanao and maybe Jolo or Jolo, and to the Maroon communities in northern Luzon, by the end of the century, Spanish society was more or less permanently settled in the Philippines. That the Spanish were able to achieve this is perhaps testimony to the innovative means with which successive governors attempted to address their military weakness. The most notable of these means was the widespread recruitment of indigenous soldiers to supplant and, in many cases, completely outnumber the Spanish troops. The indigenous soldiers were mobilized in extraordinary levies in times of need for defensive expeditions of conquest against the Dutch or Moros. I think we should explain that the Moros, I believe, are indigenous people of the Philippines that rebelled. I believe
Oh,
that
okay.
they might be Islamic Muslims from Mindanao, but I could be wrong. Expeditions of conquest or indigenous rebellion. Over the course of the century, we have records for at least 31,445 indigenous soldiers being levied in this way. See, that's so many freaking
Yeah.
people.
Well, see,
Like,
that draws the question to me as to like, did they like the Spanish or something? Because like that amount of indigenous soldiers, you would have think they could have just slaughtered all the Spanish and just been done with the whole thing.
I think religion plays a bigger factor than maybe we both like realize because maybe once they become Christians, they just dedicated their lives to fighting for Spain. Maybe they thought that like I don't know,
Well, yeah,
but
because it wouldn't be so much now. I don't think it'd be so much nationality as it is tied together, right? The whole like you're a Spaniard and you're part of this empire, therefore you're also a Christian. So they probably tied the two concepts together to foster more loyalty. I bet you that's what it was. And then maybe the first generation it'd be hard to keep them under range, but that's probably when you had the most soldiers to keep people under range. But as successive generations are bored into the Spanish Empire, right? And as
yeah,
Christians, it's harder for those people to feel the desire to just overthrow everything they've known since birth. You know, maybe
yeah,
that's what it is.
yeah. The Spaniards took over the Philippines. What was it? It was 30 years after 1530, so sometime around the 1560 something, maybe 1570, and they were there for a good 16, 17, 18, 300 something years, if I'm not correct. You can't, how is it not possible that the freaking outpost all the way in the Pacific Ocean, there wasn't enough people to rebel against them? Clearly, like something else, there's another factor in this. And I think that is that, like, Spanish soldiers, despite the weaponry that they have, it doesn't matter, in my opinion. They had a lot of people in the Philippines that we just read right now that were on their side. I think the more people that Spanish priests were able to convert to Christianity, the more they would, the more people they had in the military, the soldiers.
Yeah.
But it's just really insane to me because there were a lot of uprisings and rebellions, and they even said like you can read about it. Like Spain never had complete control, especially there's three major regions of the Philippines. First one's Luzon. I think the second one is it's called Visayas. And then the third one is Mindanao, which is like the southern area region, big island. Um, and it was mostly Muslim, but it was never like under complete like control. There weren't even that many Spaniards there to begin with. So yeah, it's always interesting because like, do you say a country's conquered if you don't have like enough soldiers to like supplant? that's the correct word, to occupy like every part of the country. I don't know.
I don't
Something
think
like
it's
that.
truly conquered in that point. I think it's just the people, or I guess they just accepted, like they just wanted to have that Spanish government over them, but they could have just killed them all and kicked them out
Yeah,
at any time. Really,
yeah. Like
there's
did the
nothing that would have
Spanish?
prevented it.
No, I agree. And like did the Spanish like occupy the whole Americas? No, like because I was reading this article about the Mapuches, where the Spaniards throughout the whole time of colonization they never conquered like the southern part of Chile, Argentina area,
Yeah,
um, until like Chile and Argentina became actual countries, and then it didn't end. Well, it's another time for another story. But yeah, going back. Yeah, it's just crazy to me, man. Like 300 years, this weak outpost. Um, I don't know, man. You must have had some like really loyal like soldiers, indigenous, Filipino soldiers from that wanted to fight for Spain. I guess, man.
I guess
Because
I guess it's the I guess it's the religious Christian element that's why.
mm-hmm,
Maybe if there wasn't any proselytizing, if there was no missionaries, Spain would have never gotten even halfway as far without the missionaries and the religion aspect.
definitely, I think so too. I think the people there in that country took religion quite seriously. I mean, if you look at the country now, it's pretty Catholic Christian, I believe.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, uh, if you look back at that time, I don't know, and I guess the soldiers that fought for them enjoyed that way of life. Maybe I don't know. Society, like I don't think they were forced. Like hello, there's like you outnumber the Spaniards like 10-1, like. But they
Yeah.
did. I did read something about there were encomiendas there, but I don't think it was like all Spaniards. Like I don't know. I'll have to read more about it. Um, I think encomiendas were there for like a brief period of time, but the people that were enslaved were like typical like slaves of other Filipino people. Um, but anyway, I digress. I think we started here at the gradual resilience.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I can read it. The
Okay.
gradual
Sure.
resilience on indigenous Filipinos for the conquest and control of their indigenous populations represents a final acknowledgement by Spanish officials that their own forces were insufficient or unreliable. It also highlights the inadequacy of colonial scholarship that has traditionally attempted to construct an unassailable dichotomy between conquered and conqueror. Recently, the historian Matthew Restel has interrogated the historical image of the Spanish conquistador, arguing that centuries of reimagining the Spanish conquest of the Americas have constructed the conquistador as an ahistorical, immortal hero who is represented as a glorious professional soldier capable of the ultimate domination of heathen peoples. Yet the initial conquest of the Americas took place before the advent of the military revolution in Europe, and thus the men who served in these conquests hardly meet our idea of professional soldiers. I mean, I agree. None of these men, like, okay, I'm not saying none, right? But a huge portion of these men, it's not like they were like knights and nobles from Europe arriving to the
Mm-hmm.
Americas with trained men at arms and soldiers. And it, like, no, they
It's
weren't professional.
conscripts.
Yeah, they were not professional soldiers, really, in many instances, dude. A lot of the people that were like successful professional soldiers that were like knights, that were fucking men at arms, that were reputable men, they stayed in Europe, dude. They fought in Europe. The king kept them close. It's not like the king would send his best knights and nobles and fighters across the ocean away from him. He needs them there in Spain because they were always fighting against other European powers. So I completely agree with this. Like these people weren't like fucking the greatest trained men or fighters, not at
Mm-hmm.
all. James Lockhart's famous study of the conquistadors of Cajamarca draws similar conclusions. These same myths have had an impact on our understanding of the ordinary soldiers who consolidated Spanish territorial gains across the New World in the centuries that followed. Viewed simply as the heirs of the conquistador heroes of the centuries past, these soldiers have been denied their own agency as historical subjects within the project of empire building. They have consequently attracted very little interest from historians of empire. The article has sought to demonstrate that we have to confront our understanding of the agency not only of indigenous people in the face of empire, but also of those who have traditionally been considered empire's greatest protagonists. Spanish soldiers serving in the Pacific were themselves subjects and at times victims of empire. uprooted from the communities in Spain and New Spain, but the larger socioeconomic changes that accompanied imperial expansion. Many were vagabonds, petty criminals, highwaymen, and illegal immigrants, in addition to playing the role of soldier in the further reaches of the empire. Their relationship to empire was thus much more complex than is often acknowledged. Our understanding of early modern empire construction can thus be reshaped through an analysis that looks beyond intellectual, political, and administrative origins towards the people who actually undertook the project of colonization. On the colonial frontier, we see European empires adopting military recruitment strategies from Europe, including forced conscription, convict transportation, and reliance on vagabonds and other undesirables. Yet the unique environment of the frontier changed the nature of this military service. The 17th century Philippines, 2,000 soldiers were given the task of conquering, pacifying, controlling more than 1 million Philippine Indios, as well as defending the borders of the empire against attack from the competing European rivals and powerful Southeast Asian communities. Within this tenuous context, the origin of soldiers and the conditions under which they served became important factors not only for assessments of the efficacy of empire building in Southeast Asia, but also for the challenging the myth of unassailable European dominance.
Humanizing and complicating the face of imperialism thus helps to demonstrate the ways in which empire was constantly contested from both within and without. While soldiers stationed in the Pacific were involved in continuous acts of conquest, pacification, and the imposition of imperial control, they did not necessarily engage in the acts of their own free will. Their support was for the most part tacit, but could turn quickly to dissent when they chose to mutiny or desert. Ultimately, the story of the soldiers who served in the Philippines undermines a technological view of empire and demonstrates that at least in the first century or so of the Spanish presence in the Pacific, the continuity of empire was always fragile and uncertain. Yet, we know that the Spanish presence in the Pacific continued for 2 centuries after the close of this narrative. The Manila galleons continued to crisscross the Pacific until the beginning of the Mexican War of Independence in 1810, carrying with them cargoes of silk and silver, as well as soldiers and forzados. Throughout the 18th century, the Philippines became a common place of exile for social miscreants and the political dissidents. Many of those who crossed the Pacific found a home within Filipino communities by taking Filipino wives. As Garcia de los Arcos has also noted that all the Spaniards who married into Filipino communities necessarily did so with the blessing of Spanish authorities. So, kind of tells you something, although it was through force of this marriage. Numerous cases exist in the late 18th century of Spanish soldiers when deserted their posts to live within indigenous communities, often outside Spanish control. Hence, even though the empire persisted in the region, the stories presented here demonstrate that an exclusive focus on the victimization of indigenous people and the monolithic dominance of Spain denies the complexities of confrontation and contestation that defined life in the Spanish Pacific. The world as we live in now, delineated by the borders and nations rather than empires and island communities, was shaped as much by the history of contestation and negotiation as it was by the realities of oppression and exploitation which empire so commonly wreaked.
All right, and that's the whole thing.
Yeah, that's it. So, what are your thoughts on it, Wanchaloa? Do you think there's a lot more to be unraveled than what we're told of the mighty Spaniards, the mighty Iberian Spaniards?
Yeah, I actually like him making that point about like this mythological view we have of what the conquistadors were and looked like. I think that needs to be explored more because people like really like, and especially the narratives here where it's like 60 Spanish horsemen defeated thousands of warriors. It's just not possible. It's really not. I think it's complete bullshit because it's ridiculous to think. It's ridiculous to think 60 men on horses would defeat 2,000 people. You can't do it. Even if these men were in full plate armor, trained as knights since birth, had lances, you know, even that would still not kill 2,000 people because fucking there's always going to be weak spots in the armor. People can be knocked off their horses. You know, people get tired. The knights would get tired. The horses aren't, you know, they can be armored, but I mean, there's still weaknesses in the horse that you could kill the fucking horse. So that's what I'm saying.
Living, breathing things.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, you know, I don't. If 60 knights in full plate armor with lances and armored horses couldn't take out 2,000 people, there's no way Spanish conquistadors that weren't even fully armored could do so. It's complete fantasy. It's complete and utter fantasy to believe any of those stories. They're not true. I don't understand in any scenario how it could happen, because it's not like they were running around with AR-15s.
Yeah, it makes you almost feel like, was the Philippines country more so occupied for a good portion of these centuries, more so than being colonized?
I would say I would go with that. I think there was just an occupation of you know, Spaniards there, rather than them truly having conquered anything. I don't think they truly conquered it.
I think the first century definitely was more of an occupation. They went through. If we think of a map of the Philippines, they landed in like the east portion of one of the islands, and then they kind of made their way up to a city called Manila. And it's funny is because I read something where there was a city there before like Manila. Manila is where the capital is in the Philippines, and that's where like the Spaniards like built like a lot of colonial architecture. They built a city there, but supposedly there was already a city before Manila was even there, before like the Spaniards like got there. So I guess like a lot of things were destroyed, and then like similar to what the Spaniards did in the Americas, they just destroyed a city and put their own on top of it. But then that city was destroyed during World War II. You know, the Japanese like were going to war with like all the countries in Asia, and specifically the Philippines. When the Americans came to the Philippines, the Japanese were all over Manila in the city, and they were just hiding in buildings and whatnot. So the easiest way for what the Americans thought we could do was just like bomb that city to pieces. So basically almost like I think 80-90% of like the Spanish like built city was destroyed.
Damn.
So it's pretty crazy. But yeah, again, another time for another story.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it is. It's worth to like read up about this, because I think like, you know, there's a lot more reality.
I wonder if there are historians or anybody that like how I'm picking it apart, if anybody challenges like those narratives, like of like 60 men taking out 2,000, because it sounds ludicrous. There's just no way it could happen in my eyes.
Same with the what Pizarro says when they said like, yeah, we killed like 80,000 people or something with just like 100 Spaniards.
I think how does that not seem like it's just gross exaggeration, like to lie to the king? It's nothing but fantasy, exaggeration, and lying to the king to make yourself look good. These people wanted to look good. Of course they're going to exaggerate stories. There's no way 60 men can take out even 2,000 people. It just wouldn't even happen. If those 2,000 people are intent on killing the 60 men, they're not going to be defeated by 60 men on horses. It's just not going to happen, especially when they're not fully armored, bro. And dude, you know how men at arms or just soldiers in Europe broke knights' charges? Because knights' charges were actually like very devastating, right? Because you had the whole horse was fully armored, the knight was fully armored, so you're talking about a lot of weight, and the horses were huge because they were bred specifically for the knights, right? So they would have the lances, right? And you'd have the hundreds of knights charging at these infantrymen. And the way these infantrymen would stop the knights is they would simply have their pikes or spears, and they would hold the line. And the horses aren't, you know, they're a living, breathing thing. They care about themselves, so they're not going to charge straight into spikes like they do in the movies. That doesn't happen in real life. So then that would break the charge, and so that would break the knight's charge, and they would scatter to the right or to the left. So you're telling me none of these natives, none of our ancestors thought to just simply hold the fucking line with some pikes and break a Spanish charge? that's insane to think that. That's a bold assertion to assume nobody would have thought of that simple fucking tactic of just hold the fucking line with the spear. The horse isn't going to charge into the spear. So I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I don't believe any of that shit. There's no way 60 people could take out 2,000.
Yeah.
It's
I don't
lying,
think
dude.
so either. There's a lot of lying. And
maybe
the
they're
conquistadors
just
were known.
Maybe they're just lying. They're like, 60 Spaniards, and then they leave out and plus 2,000 / Gaulans took out 2,000 people. They probably just leave out the plus 2,000.
Of course, they leave it out. They like to make it sound like it was just like Spaniard superiority.
Yeah.
But they always leave out like the Colin auxiliaries. The Perpetua, I think, helps too.
Yeah.
Speaking of Perpetua, just kidding.
Yeah, let's not.
Stop there.
Yeah, let's stop there.
But yeah, I was just gonna say that like there's a guy, I think he's a YouTuber and he's of Perpetua descent, and he's pretty cool. I think he's on. He follows us, so yeah. Shout out to that Perpetua, pure Perpetua. Anyway, yeah. So I hope you guys have really enjoyed our video. Again, we got more stuff planned for the future. I'm always jotting ideas down. But if you guys have any questions, just please let us know. Really appreciate it. Again, please like if you enjoyed the video, comment, leave what you want. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good day. Do you have anything, Juan?
For the haters, we hate you too.
Most definitely.
Get a life.
Get a life, yeah. But that being said, we will see you guys later. See you.